Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications because what you're about to hear isn't just another prison story. It's a haunting real-life case from inside Rikers Island, one that exposes a darkness even the walls couldn't contain. It started with a sound no one in the unit could ignore, a man's voice echoing through steel doors, begging for help. "Please, I need medical." The guards walked past like ghosts, their footsteps heavy, indifferent. Hours later, silence. Jason Echevarria was found lifeless in his cell, his body twisted in agony, foam around his mouth, the stench of something chemical in the air. But how did it come to this? How did a 25-year-old man, already in one of the most secure facilities in America, end up dying from something so horrifying, so preventable, that it would later ignite federal outrage? To understand Jason's final moments, we have to go back to Rikers Island, a place most inmates described as a city of pain. Behind a razor wire, it wasn't just criminals who ruled, but chaos, neglect, and silence. The year was 2012, and Jason had been placed in the mental health assessment unit, a section meant to protect vulnerable inmates. Instead, it was a pressure cooker of broken minds and boiling tempers. Jason wasn't the kind of inmate you'd expect to die this way. He made mistakes, yes, small-time crimes, nothing that should have earned him a death sentence. But inside Rikers, punishment had a different definition. Those who spoke too loud, those who complained, those who asked for help, they were often ignored or labeled as trouble. One night, correctional staff handed out cleaning chemicals, a routine task, except these weren't harmless supplies. Among them was a highly toxic cleaning agent used to disinfect cells after contamination. Jason, desperate, unstable, and reportedly punished for an earlier incident, ingested it. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was an act of despair. But what came after would reveal something far darker. When Jason started screaming that his throat was burning, that he couldn't breathe, that he'd swallowed poison, officers didn't rush in. They didn't call medical. Some even laughed. "He's faking it," one said. Minutes turned into hours. His voice faded. Then silence. By morning, Jason was dead. The autopsy would confirm it. Chemical burns in his throat and stomach, internal bleeding, signs of severe distress. But the real question wasn't how he died. It was why no one tried to save him. Inside Rikers, secrets don't last long. Whispers started to spread among inmates and even staff. They knew he was dying. They didn't care. Orders came from above. Leave him. The story of Jason Echevarria wasn't just about one man's suffering. It was a reflection of a system that turned a blind eye when it mattered most. A system where power overshadowed humanity. And as investigators began to dig, one chilling fact would surface. A fact that would shatter the silence of Rikers and expose the truth about what really happened that night. But before that truth came out, someone tried to bury it. When investigators finally arrived at Rikers, the air was thick with tension. The official story didn't add up. Jason's death was being brushed off as an unfortunate incident. But whispers from inside the mental health assessment unit told a different story. Guards who worked that night were nervous, their answers rehearsed, their eyes shifting away when asked simple questions. Something was off. One officer, who later spoke under anonymity, described that night in chilling detail. He said Jason had been punished earlier for an altercation with staff. They'd locked him in his cell, stripped of dignity, left with nothing but the walls and his own thoughts. The inmates nearby remembered hearing him scream after swallowing the chemical. Not once, not twice, but for hours. He kept saying his insides were burning, one inmate recalled. He begged them to call medical, but they never came. The officer in charge of the unit that night was Captain Terrence Pendergrass, a name that would soon make headlines. To many, he was known as strict, cold, unbending, the kind of man who believed weakness had no place in his unit. When a subordinate approached him and said Jason had swallowed a toxic substance, Pendergrass reportedly dismissed it. "Don't call medical," he ordered. "If he wants attention, he can wait till the morning." That decision sealed Jason's fate. When medical staff finally arrived the next day, Jason's body was already stiff. The stench of chemical and decay filled the cell. It wasn't the kind of death anyone could easily forget. But inside Rikers, memories were dangerous, and silence was the safest currency. Reports were filed with missing details, statements were vague, and suddenly, people who had been there that night seemed to remember less and less. The Department of Correction quickly went into damage control. They called it a tragic accident. But Jason's family didn't buy that. His mother, heartbroken and furious, demanded answers. "My son was crying out for help," she said, her voice trembling through tears, and no one came. How can they call that an accident? Her persistence sparked what the system hoped would never happen: a federal investigation. The FBI began pulling reports, interviewing officers, reviewing security logs. They found inconsistencies, omissions, and a disturbing pattern. Jason's pleas had been ignored not by mistake, but by choice. When the coroner's report came back, it painted a horrific picture. Jason hadn't died instantly. He'd suffered for hours. His stomach lining was burned through, his organs damaged beyond repair. This wasn't just neglect, it was torture by silence. As news of the investigation leaked, Rikers Island's dark reputation grew. Journalists camped outside. Human rights groups demanded reform. But within those walls, officers and inmates alike knew the truth. Rikers had always been like this. Jason's story was only the one that finally reached daylight. Yet even as the federal case gained momentum, some inside the system were working quietly to keep certain names out of it, to erase evidence, shift blame, and make sure no one at the top took the fall. What happened next would expose not just one man's death, but a culture of cruelty that had thrived for years behind locked doors. And when the truth came out, the name Rikers Island would never sound the same again. The headlines were brutal. Rikers inmate dies after swallowing toxic cleaner. But even that didn't capture the full horror of what had happened behind those locked metal doors. For most of the public, it was just another tragic prison story. But for those who knew Jason, his family, his fellow inmates, and a few brave insiders, it was something far deeper. It was proof of a system that valued power over life. The federal investigation had officially begun, led by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. The agents who took the case weren't just looking for answers. They were looking for accountability. They knew Rikers Island had a long history of abuse and cover-ups, but Jason's case stood out. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial, it was damning. FBI agents combed through hours of logs, radio calls, and reports. They questioned every officer who had been on duty that night. Some denied knowing anything. Others admitted that they heard Jason's screams, but claimed they were following orders. Those two words, following orders, became the haunting refrain of the investigation. Captain Terrence Pendergrass, the officer in charge, had been on duty for barely a week in that particular unit. Yet, he'd already earned a reputation among staff for his no-nonsense attitude. Some said he was a good leader. Others said he ruled by fear. But when investigators began to dig into his disciplinary record, they found red flags, prior complaints, allegations of excessive force, and a trail of ignored warnings about his leadership style. One correctional officer, trembling as he testified before a federal grand jury, recalled going to Pendergrass that night. "Captain, the inmate in cell 7A swallowed something bad. He's vomiting, screaming. He needs medical." The captain looked at him, expression cold, and said, "I don't want to hear about no inmate swallowing crap. Let him deal with it." That single statement would later become the linchpin of the federal case. Meanwhile, Jason's family refused to stay silent. His mother, a woman of quiet strength, turned her grief into determination. She appeared in front of cameras, holding up her son's photo, a young man with hopeful eyes and a troubled past, demanding justice. "He was my son. He wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve to die begging for help." Her words rippled through news broadcasts across the country, stirring outrage and empathy in equal measure. Civil rights organizations joined her cause, calling for a complete overhaul of Rikers operations. They published reports detailing the pattern of neglect that had plagued the facility for decades. Mental health inmates left untreated, guards using isolation as punishment, and a code of silence that protected officers from accountability. Behind closed doors, city officials scrambled to manage the fallout. The Department of Corrections leadership knew the spotlight was turning hot. Statements were drafted, press releases polished, but the truth kept leaking from insiders, whistleblowers, even inmates brave enough to risk retaliation. One inmate smuggled a handwritten letter out of Rikers, addressed to a journalist. Jason screamed all night. We banged on our doors, yelling for help. The officers laughed. Around midnight, he stopped screaming. We knew he was gone. That letter hit the press like a bomb. It shattered the official narrative and forced the city to respond. For the first time, prosecutors considered bringing criminal charges against a correctional captain, something nearly unheard of in the history of New York's jail system. As the legal wheels turned, Pendergrass maintained his innocence. Through his attorney, he claimed he never knew Jason had ingested anything toxic. He said he thought it was another inmate faking illness to get attention. But the evidence, the testimony of officers, the missing medical call logs, the timing of events, painted a picture of deliberate neglect. In 2014, 2 years after Jason's death, the case reached a grand jury. It was no longer just about one inmate's suffering. It was about whether the justice system could hold its own enforcers accountable. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, reporters, family members, and correctional officers watching nervously from the back. When the federal indictment was read aloud, the words echoed through the chamber. Captain Terrence Pendergrass is charged with willfully violating the constitutional rights of Jason Echevarria by failing to provide necessary medical care. The city was stunned. Rikers Island, a fortress of secrecy for decades, was being forced into the light. And as the trial began, witnesses took the stand one by one, each testimony more disturbing than the last. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of that night. A man dying in agony, a chain of command paralyzed by cruelty, and a captain who chose indifference over humanity. But deep inside Rikers, where fear ruled stronger than justice, officers whispered among themselves. If they can take down a captain, one said, none of us are safe. Others weren't so sure. Some quietly hoped this would finally force change, that Jason's death might mean something. Yet, as the trial reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A new piece of evidence emerged, one that would tilt the scales and expose just how deep the corruption inside Rikers really went. And when that truth came out, it wouldn't just ruin reputations. It would change Rikers forever. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution introduced a piece of evidence no one saw coming. A series of internal incident reports and handwritten notes recovered from within Rikers administration files. These weren't just routine paperwork. They were records that had been hidden, altered, and in some cases destroyed. And in the middle of them, there was one name written over and over again: Captain Terrence Pendergrass. Federal prosecutors presented the evidence methodically. They displayed the night logs from Jason's unit, the mental health assessment unit, where the entries between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. were mysteriously missing. The correctional officers on duty couldn't explain why. It must have been a clerical error, one said. But investigators had already determined those logs had been manually removed. The timing was no coincidence. It covered the exact hours Jason Echevarria was crying for help. Then came the kicker: a correctional officer's written note, found crumpled in a locker room months later. It read, "Captain said not to call medical. If we do, we'll deal with it later. Just lock it down." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched one of the officers who had worked under Pendergrass that night. When confronted, he broke down on the stand. "I wanted to help," he said, voice trembling. He was screaming. "I went to the captain twice. He told me to shut it down. Said we don't reward bad behavior." The officer paused, eyes wet with guilt. By morning, the kid was gone. I still hear his voice. The jury looked shaken. Even seasoned court reporters couldn't mask their disgust. The defense tried to paint the testimony as emotional exaggeration, the words of a guard under pressure, trying to save himself. But the evidence kept piling up. Security call logs, chain of command orders, testimony after testimony, all pointing to the same conclusion. Jason's death wasn't an accident. It was a preventable tragedy that officials chose to ignore. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the case had ignited a national conversation. News outlets across the U.S. ran nightly segments. Advocates for prison reform appeared on talk shows demanding justice. The name Rikers Island became synonymous with cruelty and systemic rot. For years, activists had tried to expose the corruption within those walls, but this case gave them a face, a story, and a name. Jason's mother was at every hearing. She sat quietly in the front row, clutching her son's photo, the same photo she'd shown the world 2 years earlier. When reporters approached her, she spoke softly but firmly. "This isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. My son was treated like he didn't matter. But he mattered to me, and he should have mattered to them." Her words carried a weight that echoed across headlines and into the hearts of viewers everywhere. As the trial went on, shocking new testimonies revealed just how deeply ingrained neglect had become at Rikers. Former inmates testified about officers ignoring suicide attempts, withholding medication, and punishing the mentally ill for crying out. One former correctional health worker described the mental health unit as a forgotten place. She said, "If you went in there, you came out broken, if you came out at all." Inside the courtroom, prosecutors argued that Pendergrass had failed in his most basic duty, to protect those in his custody. They described Jason's final hours in excruciating detail. The ingestion of the cleaning chemical, a highly corrosive agent meant to disinfect cells, caused intense internal burns. Jason had screamed for hours as the acid-like fluid tore through his throat and stomach lining. He was alive when help could have saved him, the prosecutor said, her voice trembling with emotion. But the captain chose to do nothing. When the defense presented its case, it leaned heavily on the argument of misunderstanding. They claimed Pendergrass wasn't informed that Jason had swallowed anything toxic, that he thought it was a routine behavioral issue. "My client isn't a monster," his attorney insisted. He followed procedure. He believed the inmate was manipulating staff. It's tragic, yes, but it's not criminal. But jurors weren't convinced. They'd seen too much, heard too much. The evidence of deliberate indifference, the missing logs, the ignored pleas, the officer's testimony, painted a damning picture. Then, the moment of reckoning came. After weeks of arguments, witness accounts, and hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom stood still. The judge asked the foreperson, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson said, voice steady but heavy. In the case of United States versus Terrence Pendergrass, on the charge of depriving inmate Jason Echevarria of his constitutional rights under color of law, how do you find the defendant? The pause that followed felt like forever. Then the word came, clear and final. "Guilty." A wave of emotion rippled through the room. Jason's mother sobbed quietly, clutching her chest. Reporters rushed to the doors. Some officers lowered their heads, others sat frozen. For the first time in years, Rikers Island silence had been broken, not by another inmate's scream, but by the sound of justice finally catching up. The judge's gavel struck hard. Captain Terrence Pendergrass is hereby convicted. He faced up to 10 years in federal prison. But as the crowd filed out of the courtroom that day, one truth lingered. Jason's death was only one story among many. Behind those same walls, hundreds of others still lived in fear, their voices unheard, their pain unseen. The verdict didn't end the darkness at Rikers. It only lit a small candle in an endless hallway of shadows. And as investigators began to uncover more cases like Jason's, the public started asking a new question. If this is what happens when someone speaks out, how many more never will? The conviction of Captain Terrence Pendergrass sent shockwaves through the correctional world. For the first time in recent history, a Rikers Island official was held criminally responsible for the death of an inmate. To many on the outside, justice had finally been served. But for those inside the system, officers, inmates, and advocates, it was only the beginning of something much bigger. News outlets across the U.S. flooded the airwaves with coverage. CNN, the New York Times, The Guardian and NBC News ran feature after feature exposing the rot beneath Rikers' concrete surface. Former officers started speaking out, describing a toxic culture built on fear and silence. "You follow the chain of command," one said. "You keep your head down, or you become the next target." Jason Echevarria's name became a rallying cry for reform. Activists gathered outside City Hall with banners that read, "Justice for Jason," and "End Rikers corruption." His mother stood at the front of every protest, her quiet voice now amplified by thousands who demanded that no one else's child die in a cell the way Jason had. "He was human," she said during one televised rally. "He deserved help, not neglect." Inside the Department of Correction, the walls were closing in. Investigations expanded beyond Jason's case. Federal oversight committees demanded access to records, while internal memos revealed that similar incidents had been swept under the rug for years. One report uncovered that in the same year Jason died, at least a dozen other inmates in mental health units had suffered severe injuries or died under suspicious circumstances. Most were labeled as accidents or self-inflicted. The city's leadership was under pressure. The mayor's office faced public outrage, and politicians who had long ignored Rikers' problems suddenly called for reform. "This can't happen again," one council member declared at a press conference. Rikers Island has become a stain on New York City's conscience. Meanwhile, inside the prison itself, tension was boiling over. Correctional officers felt betrayed by the system that had always protected them. Some saw Pendergrass's conviction as a warning, proof that the administration would throw anyone under the bus when the heat turned up. Others, though, quietly agreed that the punishment was deserved. "We're supposed to protect them," one officer admitted. But somewhere along the line, we forgot that. Inmates began speaking more freely to journalists and investigators. They described conditions that bordered on medieval: overcrowded cells, broken plumbing, infestations, and violence that never seemed to end. "You can't sleep at night," one said. "You hear people crying, screaming, and no one comes. They treat you like you're less than human." The city responded with promises. Promises of new training for officers, better mental health programs, stricter oversight, and even talk of closing Rikers altogether. But for many, it felt like too little, too late. The damage was already done. Jason's death had peeled back the curtain on decades of systemic abuse. The public now saw Rikers not as a place of rehabilitation, but as a human warehouse built on fear, indifference, and control. In 2015, as part of the federal sentencing, Pendergrass faced the judge one final time. The courtroom was filled again, reporters, family members, and advocates waiting to hear the outcome. When the judge spoke, his words carried both weight and warning. "Captain Pendergrass, you held authority over men who had no voice, no power. In your position, indifference is not an option. Your failure to act cost a man his life. The law does not turn away from that." The gavel struck. Pendergrass was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. To Jason's family, it wasn't enough. No sentence could replace the son they lost. But it was something, a spark of accountability in a place that had long thrived without any. Outside the courthouse, Jason's mother faced the cameras once again. Her voice was calm but fierce. "My son is gone, but his story will save others. That's what he deserves, for his death to mean something." Her words resonated across the country. The Department of Justice used Jason's case as a cornerstone example in their broader campaign to reform New York's jails. Rikers Island would now face ongoing federal monitoring, mandatory policy changes, and strict mental health protocols. Still, deep inside those same cell blocks, not much had changed, not yet. Inmates still whispered Jason's name like a cautionary tale. "You remember that guy in 7A?" they'd say. "The one they left to die?" His story traveled from unit to unit, from inmate to inmate, a haunting reminder that the system could break anyone, even those it was meant to protect. But outside those walls, Jason's story continued to grow in documentaries, news specials, and social media movements. It sparked debates about the American prison system, mental health, and the meaning of justice itself. He had become a symbol, not of tragedy alone, but of the demand for change. And yet, beneath all the noise, the lawsuits, the policy talks, and the promises of reform, one question still lingered. The question no investigation had fully answered. Was Jason's death truly an accident of negligence? Or was it the result of something even darker, something no one dared to admit? The years that followed Jason Echevarria's death reshaped not only Rikers Island, but also the nation's perception of prison justice. His story became a mirror reflecting America's most uncomfortable truth, that behind bars, some lives are treated as disposable. But even after the verdict, even after the sentencing, whispers about what really happened inside that unit on that fatal night never completely went silent. In 2017, a confidential report leaked to the press reignited the conversation. It came from within the Department of Correction, an internal audit that had never been meant for public eyes. The document revealed that Rikers officials had known for months before Jason's death that inmates were being given access to hazardous cleaning chemicals without proper supervision. Worse still, several staff members had reported the issue to their superiors, only to be ignored. The revelation stunned the public. It meant Jason's death hadn't just been the result of one man's negligence. It was the product of a broken system, a chain of decisions, and ignored warnings that stretched high above Captain Pendergrass. It wasn't one bad night. It was a pattern. The media storm reignited almost overnight. News anchors replayed courtroom footage. Protesters marched again, and Jason's name trended once more across social media. His mother, now older but still relentless, appeared on national television. They said it was one man's fault, she told the interviewer. But this shows it was never just him. My son was killed by the system, a system that thought his life didn't matter. Meanwhile, inside Rikers, the fallout was severe. The federal monitor assigned to oversee the facility uncovered widespread cover-ups, falsified incident reports, missing surveillance footage, and a long-standing culture of retaliation against officers who spoke out. Whistleblowers who tried to expose the truth found themselves transferred, demoted, or threatened. One internal email, revealed during an inquiry, summed up the culture perfectly: handle it internally. No press, no paperwork. The public outcry grew louder. Lawmakers, pushed by years of pressure from activists and journalists, began discussing what was once unthinkable: the closure of Rikers Island itself. By 2019, plans were formally announced to shut it down within the next decade. The announcement sent shockwaves across the country. For some, it felt like long overdue justice. For others, it was a symbol of how deeply Jason's story had pierced the conscience of a nation. But for Jason's family, justice still felt incomplete. The city quietly settled a civil lawsuit with his estate for millions of dollars, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing without the words "we're sorry." When reporters asked how she felt, Jason's mother replied, "Money can't bring back my son. What I want is change, real change, so no other mother has to stand where I'm standing." Years passed. Reforms came slowly. Some stuck, others faded. But the legacy of Jason Echevarria never disappeared. His story became part of criminal justice courses, documentaries, and podcasts around the world. To many, he was no longer just an inmate. He was the human face of systemic failure. And yet, buried deep in Rikers' archives, another discovery would surface one last time: a piece of Jason's own handwriting. During the investigation, an old mental health intake form had been stored away and forgotten. In it, Jason had written a note in the corner of the page, almost as if he'd known his words might one day be found. It said, "If I die in here, tell my mom I tried to get help." Those words became immortal, quoted in documentaries, painted on murals, and printed on protest signs outside courthouses. They weren't just Jason's last cry. They were a message to the world about the cost of silence. Today, the name Jason Echevarria stands as a testament to truth, the kind that can't be buried behind concrete walls. His story forced an entire system to look in the mirror, to confront the pain it created and ignored for too long. And though Rikers Island's closure still looms on the horizon, his case remains the beating heart of the movement that demanded it. Jason's life ended inside a cell, but his voice broke through those walls. His tragedy became a warning, a legacy, and ultimately, a spark for justice. So if you're watching this right now, remember Jason's story. Share it, talk about it, and never let it be forgotten. Because change doesn't start in courtrooms or offices. It starts with you, the people who choose not to look away. If this story moved you, share, and subscribe, not just for another video, but to keep stories like Jason's alive. Because the world needs to hear them. This was the case of Jason Echevarria. Thank you for watching. And remember, behind every headline, there's a human being who deserves better.